with them anymore, but only Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, he ordered them to tell no one about what they had seen until after the Son of Man had risen from the dead. The word of the Lord. Before we start to look at today's passage, I want you to think for a moment about a time in your life when you felt an emotional high. Maybe it was a time of a great accomplishment, or something big, maybe even something small, but it was great. Or maybe it was a time when you were just able to be still and be at peace. Or a time when you experienced something remarkable. Just some time when you felt joy in your heart. And we sometimes call those mountaintop experiences. Now, when you think about that moment, were you by yourself? If not, who was there with you? Right? Now, and you may have guessed this was coming, think of a time in your life when the path was particularly difficult. A time when you felt an emotional low. Maybe you had suffered from an accident or illness or a setback or a disappointment, a loss or a tragedy. Maybe your confidence was shaken or there was deep concern about what the next step in your life should be. Maybe it was just as simple as an inability to get up out of bed in the morning. Where were you when you were at your low point? Were you alone? If not, who was there with you? Now, let's think about Jesus' journey. Today, we reach a turning point in Mark's gospel. Up until now, Jesus had been ministering in the northeastern part of Israel. He'd been teaching and healing and quieting storms and feeding thousands and confronting authorities and building up the disciples. And all the while, people in the area had been asking, who is he? Now, in the first half of the gospel, the identity of Jesus has been somewhat obscured, maybe even intentionally. But now he's ready to talk about it. Now, before this story, before Peter and James and John go up the mountain that we read, Jesus asks his disciples, who do the people say that I am? But what he's really interested in is who the disciples say that he is. Peter's the one to speak up. He says, you are the Christ. And the word Christ means Messiah, and it indicates God's anointed one. The one in whom God's power and purposes will be made known. So far, so good. But, like most Jewish people at the time, Peter must have had some expectations about God's Messiah. Specifically, he would have imagined that Christ would be strong and powerful in the traditional kind of ways. The Messiah was going to provide leadership and protection to God's people and to restore the kingdom of David. So when Jesus says that the Messiah must suffer and be rejected and killed and finally rise, Peter does more than object. He takes hold of Jesus and he scolds him. He tries to correct Jesus. He's objecting intellectually to the idea that God's Messiah would have to suffer and die. He's also objecting emotionally at the thought of having his friend go through this agony. But Jesus does not back down. He sternly corrects Peter and says, get behind me, Satan. Jesus will have to spend the second half of Mark's gospel redefining what Messiah means for people, for Peter and the disciples, and ultimately for all the world. But first, that mountaintop. Jesus leads the four of them up the mountain. There, Jesus is transformed so that his glory shines through. His clothes become amazingly bright. And he is seen to speak with two of Israel's all-time greatest heroes, Moses and Elijah. Peter, James, and John, they saw Moses and Elijah. It's like being someplace and you see Abraham Lincoln and George Washington. Now, their presence, plus that voice from heaven, should have made it clear to the disciples that Jesus was not to be doubted, let alone scolded. Peter. Jesus' words were like God's words. They were meant to be believed. And how does Peter react to all this? He says, good thing we're here. We could build some shelters for him. Now, I don't know what motivated Peter or what he had in mind when he suggested that. As Mark tells it, Peter hardly knew himself. But like the other disciples, Peter was terrified and he didn't know really how to respond to what he saw. So Peter's suggestion to build the shelters is often interpreted as a desire to stay up on the mountaintop. He wants to build a place to live where it's safe and shiny and reassuring. So think again about your mountaintop, that emotional high that you remembered earlier. Don't we all want to stay in that place that feels so good? Peter's impulse to build the shelters up there on the mountain might reflect his resistance to facing the hard stuff back in the valley. Over and over in Mark's gospel, it's made clear that Jesus is both the Son of God, powerful with healings and teachings, but also human, who will be betrayed and persecuted and crucified. Like many Christians throughout the church's history, Peter and the disciples wanted glory, a glory they could see, without the message that they had to hear. And who could blame them? Who could blame the disciples for not wanting to believe that Jesus has to suffer? Why Jesus must suffer is a natural question to ask. And the answer is by no means clear. In Mark, where the cross is said to be necessary time and again, it's unclear why that's true. Christ will give his life to liberate many, it says in chapter 10. Sounds like a payment of some kind, right? Some scholars take another look at the necessity of cross and they say, because Jesus was a threat to the people in power. Because of that, it was inevitable that Jesus would clash with the rulers of his day and what that would lead to. Now, both of those may be true, but there may be something else. It might be that Christ's suffering was necessary, not just as a payment, and not just because of the politics, but because suffering is a part of what it means to be human. And Jesus was fully human. Jesus could have stayed on that mountaintop, but he chose to come down into the nitty-gritty of misunderstanding, of squabbling, and the disbelieving of everyday life. Down into the religious and political quarrels of the day. Down into the jealousies and the rivalries, small groups and large groups that shape our relationships. Down into the poverty and the pain that are part of life in our world. He came down to share in the difficulties that are common to humanity. He came down to walk with people in the valleys of their suffering and pain, and even through the doorway of death. Think again about your valley, your low point, your challenging path. When I asked you if anyone was there with you, did Jesus come to mind? One of the sure and certain doctrines of our faith is that whether we are aware of it or not, Jesus is with us, both at the mountaintops and also in the valleys. Christ is with us. Nothing in life or death can separate us from Christ. And his company will make all the difference. A few years ago, Haiti suffered one of their worst earthquakes of all time. It was a truly devastating earthquake. And shortly after, there was a young man on the news named Joseph who had had both of his parents die in the quake. The news had a video where they told about how his extended family had come to help him and his brothers and sisters with the burial. They saw how upset we were, Joseph said, so they performed a ritual for us. They took my parents' clothes and they wrapped it around my waist. Then they helped us to stand up and to hold the casket and to carry it over to the grave for burial. We were so weak at the time, but after they wrapped our parents' clothes around us, we could complete the burial and try to move forward. The clothes our parents wore in life gave us the courage and the strength to stand at the funeral. Imagine that. Young man wrapped in his parents' clothes that enabled him to do the hardest thing he'd ever have to do. Then I think about Jesus' transfigured clothes on the mountaintop when they became amazingly bright, brighter than anyone could bleach them. That detail in Mark's gospel tells us that we have left the ordinary for something completely outside the human experience, something extraordinary. Jesus was human, but at that moment it's clear he has power from God. So think again about your valley, your low point, your challenging path. And imagine in the midst of that darkness, wrapping Jesus' white clothing around you or putting it over your shoulders. The Apostle Paul kind of does that in 2 Corinthians when he says, God has shown into our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of God's glory in the face of Jesus Christ. So it's clear that this power belongs to God and it doesn't come from us. But we can wrap ourselves up in it. And when we do, we can endure all sorts of trouble and we won't be crushed. We may be confused, but we won't be discouraged. We may be harassed, but we won't be abandoned. We may be knocked down, but we won't be knocked out. Even if our bodies are falling apart, Paul says, deep within, we are constantly being renewed. Deep within, we are growing in the Lord. Deep within, we're being held safe by God, even in the valley. Christ's presence and power gives us the courage and the strength to do what we need to do, is to follow him. Peter learned that. Peter learned it by following Jesus up the mountain and down the mountain and into the places full of suffering and despair. There he kept seeing Christ's glory shine in all kinds of people, their highs and their lows. And Peter learned to thank God for a Messiah who was like that. In our own highs and our own lows, we can be assured that God is with us, and we can give thanks for that. In the name of the Father, and the Son,